After the Antietam battle, Confederate men crossed at Packhorse Ford below Shepherdstown, while General Jeb Stuart's cavalry crossed further upriver at the more dangerous Shepherd's Ford. After a final battle Saturday, September 20th, 1862, at Shepherdstown at Packhorse Ford, they all went into camp to rest, eat, and debug themselves. Stonewall Jackson's men encamped at Bunker Hill below Martinsburg with General Lee. Then Lee moved further south to near Stevenson's Depot. Federal Commander George McClellan confounded and vexed both the enemy and President Lincoln with myriad reasons he'd dole out for not restarting the fight with Lee's recovering but weaker army, choosing instead to vacation, as it were, on the Maryland side of the Potomac. This chapter is about that same vacation month, October 1862, but on the south side of the Potomac. A timeless tableau of people facing life and death with either compassion, despair, or transcendence immediately in the wake of the bloodiest day in American military history. The Adam Stephen Dandridge household gave succor and respite to the gregarious Confederate General Jeb Stuart, his 35 to 50 some-odd man staff, his banjo man Sam Sweeney and violin player Bob Sweeney, and the ladies of the community they charmed at the now legendary Bower Farm. The Bower, looking west from its magisterial perch atop a hill along the Opequon, remains to this day in the Dandridge family and is protected with a permanent conservation easement. The original main house burned and was rebuilt in the 1890s from the same substantial walls and on the same footprint and brick frame, but with the addition of dormers and a wraparound porch, the style of that period. One can only surmise that after the Dandridges extended their hospitality to Stuart's contingent, that upon their departure, left the Dandridge family clean out of provisions and extremely vulnerable to retribution by the Federal armies. In addition to this brief, shining moment at the Bower, we also hear of Mary Catherine McQuilkin's trial with wartime red tape, rejoicing getting home again to Pleasant View Farm, just west of Shepherdstown, and Mary Clemmer Ames, caring for the wounded at Harper's Ferry's Camp Hill as she struggled with her love-hate for the big city upper-class federal surgeon, Dr. DePeyster. And we puzzle along with the young cavalryman John Opie when General Stuart orders him to go a-kiting. There's the scandal of the wholesale straggling from the Confederate Army vexing the county's homes and families. And Mary Ambler at Summit Point picks up her pen to resume her diary entries after a hiatus. In the next video on October 1862, you hear from Private William McCarter of the Federal Irish Brigade and his unforgettable account of the parlor scene at the Clapsaddle home in Charlestown. And Mary Ambler is fretting over her strong attraction to the officers at dinner at her parents' home, Rock Hall. October 1862 in Jefferson County approaching. Thursday, September 25th, 1862. Mary Catherine Kearney struggles with the death and its red tape of her brother, John Briscoe Kearney. She wrote later in life,
"When our men were retreating from Maryland, Brother Briscoe got permission to spend the night and to join his command the next day. When I rose the next morning, he informed me that he had been very sick during the night and was not feeling well enough to join his company, but he hoped to go later in the day. As the army was passing up the Martinsburg Road, and neither Uncle or myself had ever seen thousands of soldiers together, he wanted us to go down to Brother Thornburg's and see a sight we had never seen. So we went, as Brother Briscoe seemed much better. We left him sitting in the doorway, cleaning his revolver. While on Uncle's porch, gazing at the soldiers passing, I happened to turn my head and saw poor old Uncle Andy riding under the whip and trying to keep out of the way of the army, calling to me as he rode up to the fence, 'Miss Kate, come home quick, Mr. Briscoe's dying.' Well, I ran every step across the field. I found Brother Briscoe lying on the floor where one of the colored men, with the aid of a couple of straggling soldiers, had carried him from the yard where he had fallen.
My poor heart, why do you cry? Once also you in peace will lie. All things on this earth must die. Will then we meet, you and I? My heart asks with boding pain, will faith join us once again? My heart asks with boding pain, will faith join us once again? After 2 days bitter.
He was unconscious, however, and perfectly stiff. 6 army surgeons and our family physician saw him, but could not relieve him. The second day, he passed away. He regained consciousness, however, before he died and asked me to go see his wife and children, who were living in Leesburg, as soon as I could get through the lines, which I did, intending to spend but 1 week there. The enemy got possession of Leesburg, and I tried for 3 weeks to get back home, having a Union man interceding for me. At the end of 4 weeks, he got permission to bring me over to Point of Rocks to come home. I went over, but was taken to the Provost Marshal's office. My baggage was searched, and as a Richmond paper was found in it, I was sent back across the river, where I remained 2 more weeks before I received permission from Colonel Schley, who was commanding at the point, to go home. I stayed at the hotel all night under guard, a sentinel passing my windows the entire night with his gun, back and forth, back and forth. The next morning, the colonel came into my room, handed me a paper, saying, "Sign this, and then you can go home." Knowing what it was, likely an oath of allegiance to the United States, I did not read it, but signed it. He then gave me a pass which would take me to Harper's Ferry. My instructions then were to show it at headquarters. In order to do so, I was compelled to get off the train and wander around through the mud to find headquarters. And after finding that wonderful place and showing my pass, I was guided up several flights of stairs into a building where some women were sewing on some garments for the soldiers. From where I sat, I had a good view of the railroad and made up my mind the first smoke I saw coming up the road, I was going to make for that track. So I did, and upon arriving there, I found it to be only a boxcar. I said to an officer standing by, "Can I get on this car and ride to Carneysville?" He replied, "Yes, but there's no seat in it." I assured him that made no difference. I said I could stand up. He was very kind and gentlemanly. He put a board across the corner and took off his overcoat, placed it on the board to make it a comfortable seat. I found that he was the officer who had command at the picket that was stationed at Carneysville. Believe me, I was relieved and rejoiced when I got off that car, and without even having to show my pass that I had to wander around in Harper's Ferry through the mud to find. My first letter I wrote to Brother Henry after coming home, I described the appearance of that officer and said, "If you ever come in contact with him, please don't shoot him, for he was a friend to your sister." I spent that night with Cousin Liza Hinkle and sent word to Kersley Carney that I was there. He came up for me and sent word to Brother Thornburg. We had no phone in those days, of course. And the next day he came for us. And don't say I was not glad to get home with my old uncle once more.
The Legend of the Bower. Serena Catherine Dandridge, one of the 2 eldest young daughters of the Bower's owner, wrote,
The host and hostess welcomed not only their friends, but their friends' friends, to what was merrily nicknamed Liberty Hall. The resources of the house were manifest. Fat cattle in the pastures, poultry in the surrounding hills, many gardens in the rich bottomlands in front, with 50 servants always at one's beck and call. Every bit of room availed to hold a guest. In the attic, and on vast mattresses thrown down, in lack of other accommodation, the children dreamed sweetly of the morrow. Back of the house lay numerous terraces and plots, planned and planted by the artistic taste of my grandmother. Here amidst the rich shrubberies, we'd look sheer across the valley, from Blue Ridge to the North Mountains, all over the lovely land. We gloated on the paradisical beauty of the beloved home and loved to put a wealth of flowers about it and to read its praises written, as they often were in prose or verse.
Monday morning, September 29th. Heroes von Bork from Prussia first sees the bower. The weather is very warm, dry, and dusty. When I arose from my grassy couch at sunrise on the 29th, I found indeed that the half had not been told me of the bower. Our headquarters were situated on a hill beneath a grove of lofty umbrageous oaks of primitive growth, which extended on the right towards the large mansion house, the thick brick walls of which, in the blush of the early sunlight, were just visible in little patches of red through the rich verdure of the embosoming garden. At the foot of this hill, skirting a main road to which the slope was smooth and gradual, ran the bright little river Opequon, its limpid waters breaking through and tumbling over the hills and rocks, thus forming a cascade of considerable height, with rainbows in its spray as the sun changed every falling drop into a ruby or a diamond. This lovely entourage was now enlivened and diversified by the white tents of our encampment, the general's with its fluttering battle flag in the center, by the smoke of the campfires where the Negroes were busily engaged in cooking breakfasts, by the picturesque groups of officers and men who were strolling about or cleaning their arms, and by the untethered horses and mules which were quietly grazing all over the ground. One may be pardoned some extravagance of language in attempting to describe a scene which brought a feeling of thankful happiness of the soldier, weary of the excitement, the toil, the hardship, and the anguish of war. We had now plenty of food, and our exhausted animals, which had undergone so much fatigue and privation, and our own commissariat was far more abundant than it had been for many weeks. The long mess table at which we dined together in the open air was loaded with substantials that seemed dainties and luxuries to us, who often for days together had gone without food, and at best could secure only a meager repast. Frequently, when the mocha, of which we had captured a large supply from the enemy, was smoking invitingly on our breakfast table, we had the pleasure of greeting the proprietor as a welcome guest at our morning meal. Later in the day, a lady's skirt might even be seen in the streets of our encampment. But regularly every night we proceeded with our band to the house, where dancing was kept up till a late hour.
Farewell forever to old Tennessee. Farewell, my lily dear, don't weep for me.
he brought it from a sound. Guys so curly on her head could not set a mind.
The musical director of our band was a Private Sam Sweeney of one of our regiments whom Stuart had detached to his military family for his musical talent alone. A brother of the celebrated banjo player Joel Sweeney, forerunner of all the Christies. Sam Sweeney, who also played the banjo, this favorite instrument of the family with amazing cleverness, who knew sentimental, bibulous, martial, nautical, comic songs out of number, who was carried about with him by the general everywhere, who will have a conspicuous place in some of our later adventures, and who, after having safely passed through many accidents of war, died at last of smallpox, regretted by everybody, but most of all by Jeb Stuart. Sam was assisted by two of our couriers who played the violin, musicians of inferior merit, but his chief reliance was in Mulatto Bob, Stuart's servant, who worked the bows with the most surprising and extraordinary agility, and became so excited that both head and feet were in constant employment, and his body twisted about so rapidly and curiously that one could not help fearing that he would dislocate his limbs and fly to pieces in the midst of the breakdown. General Stuart himself, always the gayest and noisiest of the party, starting usually at the close of the festivity the famous song, "If you want to have a good time, join in the cavalry, etc., etc., etc." The whole excited company, young and old, uniting in the chorus, the last notes of which sounded far through the still air of the night as we walked back to our tents. General Stuart did not like it at all if any one of his staff officers withdrew himself from these innocent merrymakings after the fatigues of the day to seek an early rest, and would always rouse him from his slumbers to take part in the revelry. Evening, Wednesday, and very early morning Thursday, October 1st and 2nd, at Martinsburg and Shepherdstown, Virginia. The festivities at the Bower were suddenly curtailed by news that Federal Cavalry Commander Alfred Pleasanton had crossed the Potomac below Shepherdstown with a large contingent, had pressed through Shepherdstown and headed across the Opequon, and began fighting with the 1st Virginia Cavalry under Tiernan Bryan and Wade Hampton's force along what is today Route 11. A temporary confusion of orders was corrected by Stuart, and there followed a long, steady withdrawal of Pleasanton's larger force back to Shepherdstown and across the river again. Pleasanton and Stuart's accounts of that protracted engagement disagree. Pleasanton writing that reports of significant losses and a coerced retreat for his force were not true. Confederate cavalryman John Opie, in fleeing from Shepherdstown earlier that day, encountered General Stuart quite by chance and took part in the fighting at Martinsburg. Opie wrote, "On October 1st, General Pleasanton, with a large body of cavalry and a battery of horse artillery, crossed over at Shepherdstown to reconnoiter, and gradually pressed our cavalry under William H.F. Lee back to Martinsburg. Lee's force consisted of one brigade and was handled very roughly by Pleasanton's superior force. During the morning, I rode in front of a Federal vedette and, shaking my saber at him, challenged him to a contest. The man deliberately got down off his horse and, taking aim from a small tree, fired his gun at point-blank range. I felt the wind from the ball, which barely grazed me, and not having a carbine was unable to return the compliment. And, had I charged him, others who were close at hand would have come to his assistance, and therefore I rode on. At Martinsburg, while skirmishing on the suburbs with the enemy's sharpshooters, General Stuart, accompanied by his aide, Reverend Walter Q. Holohan, rode up. The general asked me to what command I belonged, and I replied to none, that I had not yet decided what regiment to join, and asked him which one he would advise me to join. I was struck with his politic answer. Not wishing to make any invidious distinction, he said, "Any of them, all of them are good, but remain with me today." I did so, but the enemy still pressing us back, our men retired up the Winchester Road, when finally General Stuart, having brought up his forces from various points, determined to take the offensive, he said to me, "Go over to the Tuscarora Road, which is west of the pike and also leading into Martinsburg, and tell General Hampton my orders are for him to press the enemy with vigor on his road, and that I will attack at once. Go a-kiting, sir, and meet me in Martinsburg with General Hampton." Now, I did not know at the time that "go a-kiting" was a proverbial and favorite expression of his, and the way I rode across the country was a sight to behold. Up hill and down, over fences and ditches, I did go a-kiting sure enough, never once halting or drawing rein. In fact, I thought that the fate of the Confederacy depended upon my rapidity. I found General Hampton and delivered the order, and that gallant cavalryman with his Southern boys charged everything before him. We broke several regiments, and the enemy did not rally until we reached Martinsburg. Here they attempted to reform and make a stand, and we charged again, right into their midst, and again disordered them. Once, when near Shepherdstown, they made a halt behind their artillery, but by this time it was so dark and dusty one could not recognize the man in front of him. He halted and planted a battery of artillery on an eminence and opened fire in the direction of the enemy, who presently retired. Across the river. Here again I met General Stuart and informed him that I had ruined my horse, which could scarcely walk. In fact, my ride across the country, together with the several charges made with Hampton's men, had entirely disabled him. The general's reply was very unsatisfactory. "Get another one and try it again." The straggling from Lee's fast-moving army was immense in Jefferson County before, during, and after the Antietam conflict. As Opie saw with his own eyes, he wrote, "It is a mortifying fact, yet true, to which I was an eyewitness, and as in rejoining the army, I rode through these recreants, amounting in number to about 30,000, who were straggling and absent from the Battle of Antietam." The counties of Jefferson, Clark, and Frederick were filled with these recreant soldiers who went about in squads of from 4 to 10, and who were fed by the hospitable inhabitants. General Lee, therefore, had only about 30,000 men at Antietam to meet General McClellan with 80,000. The march of our men from Harper's Ferry to Antietam was very rapid, and this also left a great multitude of stragglers who did not cross the river. Stuart and von Bork visit the home of Lily Perrin Lee on East German Street in Shepherdstown. Lily and William F. Lee were a young military couple stationed at Jefferson Barracks, Missouri a few years prior, and became close friends there with Jeb and Flora Stuart. Society ladies there presented Stuart with silver spurs, which he enigmatically turned and gave to William Lee, a graduate of the Virginia Military Institute. After Civil War broke out, and both Lee and Stuart went with the South, Colonel Lee was wearing the spurs the moment he led an unauthorized but crucially successful charge on a federal battery that was threatening the left flank of Colonel Stonewall Jackson's brigade at the First Battle of Manassas, Bull Run, July 21st, 1861. He died 8 days later, with Lily and his family at his bedside, and Lily returned home with the spurs. It is on the visit that Stuart had the opportunity to receive the spurs from Lily Perrin Lee, which he wore until his own death in 1864 at Yellow Tavern, Virginia, at which time he asked the spurs to return to his friend Lily Lee. In von Bork's retelling of this visit to Lily Lee, he was unaware of this backstory. He wrote, "On our return through Shepherdstown, we stopped for an hour at the house of a lady, a friend of General Stuart, Mrs. Lee, who had lost her husband at the First Battle of Manassas. To her and her sisters I was presented. At a later period I became well acquainted with them. The General's presence was no sooner known in the village than a mob of young and pretty girls collected at Mrs. Lee's house, all very much excited, to such an extent indeed that the General's uniform was in a few minutes entirely shorn of its buttons, taken as souvenirs, and if he had given as many locks of his hair as were asked for, our commander would soon have been totally bald. Stuart suffered all this very gracefully, with the greater resignation, as every one of these patriotic young ladies gave him a kiss as tribute and reward. This latter favor was unhappily not extended to the staff officers, and it may be readily imagined that it was tantalizing for us to look on and not take part in the pleasant ceremony. We arrived at the Bower at a late hour of the night, but found our kind host yet awake, the excitement and anxiety of the day having prevented him from retiring. Here we obtained compensation for the loss of our dinner in an abundant supply of cold meat, and cut into a capital Virginia ham with a greater amount of destruction than we had done during the day into the ranks of the enemy. Thursday, October 2nd. Weather in the forenoon is quite warm. Afternoon, thundering, small clouds passing around. Evening, fine breeze sprang up. Anne Willis Ambler wrote from her parents' home near Summit Point at Rock Hall.
Thursday, October 2nd, 1862. Again, I am more than a week behind and cannot remember exactly what happened. This much I know, that soldiers were coming and going all the time, begging and buying. Pa was compelled to let them have whatever they wanted, as they were so insistent. Offered the highest prices. 40 cents a pound for honey, 50 cents for butter, 35 and 40 cents for bacon, 25 cents for soap, 10 cents for a head of cabbage, $1.25 a bushel for apples, and $2.50 for potatoes. Pa sold 150 bushels. It is very troublesome to be feeding soldiers all day, but they come so starved we cannot resist.
In Shepherdstown, October 3rd, 1862, Mr. William H. Crowell died, age 41, 11 months, 5 days. Thursday, Friday, October 2nd and 3rd. Mary Clemmer Ames has love-hate towards Dr. DePeyster at Camp Hill at Harper's Ferry, caring with him the wounded. But something happens to change everything on an autumnal hillside.
That night, Pierre DePeyster went the rounds of the hospitals as usual. Then he came back to the door of the room within which Irene sat alone with the two dying men. As he approached the bed, at first he thought that all three were dead. The girl kneeling at the head of the low cots seemed to have fallen forward. An arm of each man was thrown over her neck. They were dead, and she, lying there, looked as white and motionless as they. Yet it was not death. As Pierre DePeyster lifted the unresisting arms which encircled her and held her up, she opened her eyes and looked into his face. There was no swooning, no crying, no ungoverned excitement. It was a simple coming back to life and to an utter consciousness of it. "He is dead. They both are dead," said the pathetic voice. And though unutterable grief expressed in tone and gesture was more moving in their pathos than the loudest cries, it was then that Pierre DePeyster said, "You must come with me." He saw that she must find present oblivion from sorrow, or that in her very silence she would break under it. He used the will which was the strong underlying element of his character, and mentally compelled her to go. He was used to death, in some respects had become too used to it. The wholesale human slaughter by which he was surrounded had had the tendency to make the life of any one man to seem comparatively but a little thing, He had no time and no rest now to think of men individually. Neither was he free from the faults of his class, nor the spirit of caste so constantly fostered by the discipline of the army. A private, in his thought, meant a poor, ignorant Irishman or Dutchman, one of the city rabble who risked his life for $15 a month and then received more for it than he could under any other possible circumstances. Yet here upon his own bed was stretched the dead body of a common soldier, no finer and no truer than tens of thousands of his comrades who had died as he died. And here was another common soldier. Pierre de Peyster turned with a look of repulsion from the gray uniform so hateful to him, lying on the foot of the bed, covered with dust and pierced by bullets. But it faded as it fell upon the face of the wearer, so little more than a child, a fair-haired, blue-eyed boy, with an infantile smile hovering about the sunken features, so wasted by hardship and suffering. It was impossible to regard this face as the face of a foe, although he had not heard a word that the boy had spoken. The face of the other dead soldier smiled back upon his friend. It was embrowned by many months of exposure, yet it was no less beautiful in its fresh young manhood. The soft brown eyes looking forth from the half-closed lids were so like hers. The seal of blood and birth showed so plain in death. For an instant, he seemed alive to her, and Pierre de Peyster started. There were the two outstretched arms just as they had been unwound from her neck. Pierre, seeing them, realized all, and again sat down and gazed at the dead faces before him. "I am converted," he said slowly, aloud. "Either all life is changed, or I am. At last, I seem to see everything as it is. You, my poor boy, I should have hated the sight of you 6 hours ago. Looking upon your face, I see that you are not to blame. And you, if I had come to you in a ward amid 100 others, I might have seen no difference. And now, both are holy in my sight." Dawn was flushing red above the mountains where Pierre Peyster went forth from his room. Then he went into the old graveyard, which, a few rods from the hospital, stretched over the hill. "It is as I thought," he said, standing by an open grave almost covered by bushes near the old stone wall. Poor Irwin's body was taken up and sent to his friends before the surrender. The bushes have hidden this grave, and here is room for another. They can be buried side by side. Irene's Diary, October 3rd, 1862. Mother, in the quiet of the early evening, when even the torn mountains and the ravaged valley took on a look of peace, we laid, not him, but his body, down to rest, and beside it that of poor little Davy. Everything had been done that kindness could do to make their burial home-like and Christian-like. I could not but think of it, even in my grief, how different were the neat caskets from the rude box and the rough coats to which I have seen so many of our boys buried. Yes, so many without cost or box at all, just as they fell. It was Dr. de Peyster who did this for them. It was all done before I awoke. I came out of that sleep as if I had been from another world. I was so worn out. I suppose. I remember I wrote you I didn't like Dr. DePeyster. I should be very ungrateful if I could write that now. He seemed stern, even hard. I think still he has that nature now, but he has another which has covered me with a kindness that I can never forget. It seemed as if a tender providence had saved this sheltered corner in the old, overcrowded graveyard for these two boys. I don't know who found it, but I see it now, hidden from the highway by rose bushes, close to the stone wall on the very hilltop. I have much to do, but no day so much but I take a few moments to visit these graves. I cannot weep for Will now. I never shall weep for him again till I come home and see his old haunts and sit down once more in the old barn where he told me, when a boy, that he should some day be a soldier. Oh, I cannot weep here. The suffering that I see, the dying eyes that I close, would make it seem too selfish. He is a part of the vast sacrifice, the sacrifice which began on yonder mountaintop, when that heroic old martyr, insane with a holy idea, came down its sides, undaunted and alone, to be the savior of a race. But, Mother, when I realize what freedom costs, at what price this republic is preserved, I feel as if it would break my heart if its government is ever again administered by unholy men. When the war is over and I come home, I shall bring the body of our boy to rest in the spot that he loved, where we shall all rest someday. When it seems hard that we gave him, our only one, we will remember that every hillside and valley of our land is sown with the dust of its most precious sons. In almost every home, someone weeps as we do. At every table there is a vacant place that can never, never be filled in this world. So many, oh, so many will watch and wait for the boy who will never come back. And they will never know where he fell, or where he lies, or if he were ever buried. This will be so much harder to bear, and yet it must be borne.
I've wandered to the village, Tom. I've sat beneath the tree, upon the schoolhouse playing ground that sheltered you and me. But none were there to greet me, Tom, and few were left to know who played with us upon the grass some 20 years ago. The grass is just as green, dear Tom. Barefooted boys at play were sporting just as we did then, with spirits just as gay. But the master sleeps upon the hill, which, coated o'er with snow, afforded us a sliding place just 20 years ago. The river's running just as still, the willows on its side are larger than they were, dear Tom. The stream appears less wide. The grapevine swing is ruined now, where once we played the bow and swung our sweethearts, pretty girls, just 20 years ago. The spring that bubbled neath the hill, close by the spreading beach, is very low. 'Twas once so high that we could almost reach. And kneeling down to get a drink, dear Tom, I started so to see how much that I was changed since 20 years ago. By the spring upon an elm, you know I cut your name. Your sweetheart's just beneath it, Tom, and you did mine the same. Some heartless wretch had peeled the bark, 'twas dying sure but slow, just as she died whose name you cut some 20 years ago. My lids have long been dry, dear Tom, but tears came to my eyes. I thought of her I loved so well, those early broken ties. I visited the old churchyard and took some flowers to strew upon the graves of those we loved some 20 years ago. Some now are in the churchyard laid, some sleep beneath the sea, but few are left of our old class, excepting you and me. And when our time shall come, dear Tom, and we are called to go, I hope they'll lay us where we played just 20 years ago.